created by Cable for Canadians.
Welcome to all. Please join me in welcoming.
We need to challenge ourselves to think bigger.
On va vous inviter à partager vos pensées. Mesdames et messieurs, je crois que j'ai tout dit ce que j'avais à dire.
Truly is my honor to be here.
Good evening. My name is Patricia Goff, and I'm the Executive Director of the Academic Council on the United Nations System here at Wilfrid Laurier. I also teach in the Political Science Department. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for the second in the 2008-2009 Aikens Lecture Series. Tonight's panel discussion is entitled The Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 60, How Far Have We Come, How Far to Go? I'm happy also, we're especially pleased to have Canada's Cable Public Affairs channel, CPAC, filming our event tonight for rebroadcast at a later date, hence all the wonderful equipment. 60 years ago to the day, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is widely considered to be the first universal expression of the rights to which all human beings are inherently entitled. It provides a common standard for all nations and peoples. Its preamble and 30 articles outline core values that apply to everyone, everywhere. It starts by noting that the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. The Universal Declaration is not a treaty. However, it is a fundamental constitutive document of the United Nations. The Universal Declaration has been an important tool for people fighting to have their rights respected around the world. From Argentina to the Philippines to Eastern Europe, people invoke the moral force of the Declaration and the commitment by governments that it represents in their struggles against injustice. Much has been accomplished since December 10, 1948, but much remains to be done. To help us understand the influence of the Universal Declaration, we have three eminent speakers joining us this evening. Dr. Rhoda Hassman holds the Canada Research Chair in International Human Rights here at Wilfrid Laurier University. She holds a joint appointment in the Department of Global Studies and the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Dr. Hassman has gained international recognition for her extensive writing on various aspects of human rights. Her 2003 book, entitled Compassionate Canadians, Civic Leaders Discuss Human Rights, was recognized by the American Political Science Association with their Outstanding Book in Human Rights Award. 2 years later, her 2006 book, Economic Rights in Canada and the United States, was named a notable book for 2008 by the United States Human Rights Network, a coalition of 200 NGOs. Dr. Ramesh Thakur is the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs and professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. Dr. Thakur was vice rector and senior vice rector of the United Nations University in Tokyo and assistant secretary general of the United Nations from 1998 through 2007. He sat on the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty and was one of the principal authors of the Responsibility to Protect report. He is the author of over 30 books and 300 articles and book chapters. His 2006 book, entitled The United Nations, Peace and Security, won the 2008 Friends of Aikens Book Award for the best recent book on the United Nations system. Paul Heinbecker is director of the Laurier Center for Global Relations, a distinguished fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations. His diplomatic career has taken him to Canadian embassies in Ankara, Stockholm, Washington, and Bonn, in the latter case as Canadian ambassador to Germany. On the human rights front, while serving in Ottawa, he advised Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy on Canada's human security agenda, including banning landmines. He led the Foreign Affairs Task Force on the 1996 humanitarian refugee crisis in eastern Zaire and headed the Interdepartmental Task Force on Canadian participation in the 1999 Kosovo conflict, later helping to negotiate an end to the Kosovo conflict as Canada's G8 political director. At the UN, he promoted the International Criminal Court and led the Canadian delegation to the 2001 UN Human Rights Conference in Durban, among other things. Mr. Heinbecker is a graduate of Waterloo Lutheran University. At this time, I'll invite Dr. Howard Hassman to start us off.
Well, thank you very much, Patty. And Patty has already introduced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to you. So my job, I think, is to go through some of the more mundane aspects of this. The Declaration was, in fact, that. It was a declaration. It was not law, but it is the beginning of a long series of treaties and laws that have put a very strong normative emphasis on the idea that all countries in the world should be guaranteeing human rights. to all of their citizens. The Universal Declaration is one part of something called the International Bill of Human Rights, which is comprised of the Declaration and two 1976 covenants. Covenants are like treaties that countries can sign on to. One is a covenant on civil and political rights. The other one is a covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. So civil and political rights are things like the right to vote, the right not to be tortured, the right to due process in a trial. Economic and social and cultural rights include things like the right to an education, the right to health care, the right to a decent standard of living. From about 1948, for another 45 years, there was extensive debate internationally claiming that the West was pushing civil and political rights as part of a sort of democratic Western agenda, whereas economic rights especially came from the Soviet bloc, or the then Soviet bloc, the socialist bloc. In 1993, however, there was a conference on human rights in Vienna, and at that conference, states agreed that human rights were interdependent and indivisible. That is, that they interact with each other. You can't have one set without the other. So this debate about the allegedly Western focus on civil and political rights, at least in that forum, died off after about 1993. In any case, that debate ignored the substantial contribution of Western Democrats and Western Social Democrats to the Economic Rights Covenant. Going back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his focus on freedom from want as well as freedom from fear and so on and so forth, there has been a strong Western tradition of social democracy which stresses economic rights. And in fact, one of the people who first wrote the Universal Declaration was John Humphrey, a Canadian who was a law professor at McGill, who worked at the United Nations, as it then was becoming, with Eleanor Roosevelt, to formulate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, originally, human rights address violations by states of their own citizens' rights. And originally, we were looking especially, although not always, at gross human rights violations, such as genocide. So it is not just a coincidence that the day before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we got the Covenant against Genocide. So I can't remember the exact name right now. Convention, yeah. Convention on the Crimes of Genocide. So we have a law coming from 1948 which prohibits genocide. This comes in part, of course, from the reaction to the Holocaust and to later on, as people realized, the genocide of other people such as the Roma. From 1948 until the 1990s, we don't get much by the way of laws prohibiting or trying to punish genocide. And then we get, tragically, three things in a row. The international, why am I losing the ICTR?
The International Criminal Tribunal.
Yeah, the International Criminal Tribunal. They're making me nervous. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which tried people who were alleged to have committed genocide in Rwanda. Then the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. And then finally, the International Criminal Court, which has a prospective jurisdiction as of July 1st, 2002. It can try people, individuals, not states, alleged to have committed the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. We also got the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Convention Against Torture, and these again address some of the most serious human rights violations of the not just the post-war period, but ever, at least in modern history. Unfortunately, these have very weak enforcement mechanisms. Sometimes, depending on what the alleged human rights violation is, one can go to a committee at the United Nations and one can get a ruling that a state has violated an individual's human rights, or one can get an opinion that a state has violated a group's human rights or should improve its human rights record. Often the only thing that a UN group can do is what we call naming and shaming. Name a state, try to shame it into improving its behavior. When I started in this business, I thought this would be meaningless, but in fact there are states which, not all states, but many states do not like their reputation to be sullied and will try to make some improvements if they think they are going to be shamed in public fora for their human rights violations. Aside from this, we then went on, as the human rights regime expanded, to addressing what I would call social or family violations of human rights. So in 1979, after a lot of pressure by feminists, but not only by feminists, we got the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination, of all forms of discrimination against women, which is a very clumsy title, but it was a document which enumerated many ways that women's human rights were being violated, not only their civil rights, such as the right to vote, but rights such as equal treatment in credit or equal treatment in developing countries, in things like getting extension services from governments. It was, however, incomplete. There's nothing in this document about violence against women. There's only a statement about customary practices. So that took a lot more pressure by feminists until we got a declaration against violence against women from the United Nations General Assembly in 1994. We also have a document on children's rights. Again, what's happening here is that the rights are being more and more carefully enumerated to apply to different groups. And we have statements now about the rights of the disabled, the rights of the elderly, and so on. Another area where we had to consider human rights was human rights violations by private actors. And that is one area in which many students are now active, looking at human rights violations by transnational corporations. As you know, many, although not all, transnational corporations are based in the West, and many, although certainly not all, have higher revenues per year than the gross domestic products of many countries. So there has been a concern about the rights of their workers, of their employees, about consumers' rights, about environmental rights in the areas where they operate. We are slowly getting to a point where we have a normative consensus coming out not only from the UN but primarily from the United Nations, arguing that transnational corporations, even though they are private entities, have human rights obligations. We have something called the United Nations Global Compact, which is a short list of key rights such as not using child labor, and corporations can sign on to this Global Compact and give an undertaking that they will not violate its norms. We also have, coming out of the UN Human Rights Committees, a very long statement, which is in fact called the Norms, which lists everything that these committee members feel is already in the law about human rights obligations for transnational corporations. And recently, Professor John Ruggie, a very distinguished political scientist, wrote a report for the United Nations about transnational corporations and their obligations. Many activists are also concerned about international organizations, saying they should have human rights obligations. So they put pressure on the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. The World Bank, for example, has an inspection panel. So if it finances a development project, for example, building a dam, citizens are supposed to, who feel that their interests have been harmed by this project, are supposed to be able to go to the inspection panel, which is a group of independent people, and put forward their complaints. Unfortunately, that inspection panel does not yet have much influence, in part because often these decisions are made by states, not by the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund's legal counsel has offered an opinion that the International Monetary Fund is not obliged to provide people with human rights For example, their right to education. But on the other hand, it's not supposed to violate their human rights. For example, by taking away access to education. The World Trade Organization's job is to facilitate free trade among states, but it also has a general obligation to facilitate free trade in the interests of development. So some international lawyers say that that in itself is a human rights obligation, because there is a 1986 document from the United Nations about the right to development. So there's bad news and good news. The bad news, of course, I've been talking mainly about laws and treaties and norms. I have not been talking about actual practice. Some groups of people and some activities are still left out, or largely left out, of this set of norms that we've had developing since 1948. States are responsible primarily to their own citizens, not to the citizens of other countries. So we have problems for people who are stateless, that is, who are not citizens of any country. We have problems when people are aliens, illegally in a country which is not the country of which they are citizens, or even sometimes when they're legal migrants in those countries. We have problems pertaining to refugees, even though there is an international law regulating how they're supposed to be treated. Many of them are in a no man's land where they are illegal, where they're going to, they can't go home, and so on. In the realm of family and social violations, there is one extremely large, unprotected group, which at a conservative estimate of 5% of the world's population would be 315 million people, and that is gays and lesbians. We have a few decisions coming from the United Nations and from other organs such as the European Court of Human Rights protecting the rights of gays and lesbians, but we do not yet have any international covenant or declaration saying that their rights should be protected. 5% of the world's population is a fairly conservative estimate of the number of people involved here. Finally, we have, or not quite finally, we have two things. If you kill your citizens outright, and you do it because of their race or ethnicity, that's called genocide. If you introduce state policies that cause famine, that starve your citizens to death in large numbers, that does not yet appear to be covered. So we have, for example, the case of Mugabe in Africa, and we have North Korea. These are countries that have been practicing state-induced famine as matters of policy, and we do not yet have a way to address that. And we have essentially global economic apartheid. If you are a refugee because somebody is trying to kill you because of your politics, you're protected. If you're a refugee because you don't have enough food, you are not protected. You are not considered to be a legal refugee. So if you're fortunate enough, as we are, to live in Canada, then you're essentially like a white South African. If you live in many other parts of the world, you're like a black South African. The good news is that aside from these international laws and these very weak enforcement mechanisms, we now have a very strong civil society of independent actors, citizens all over the world, acting for human rights. In the beginning, shortly after World War II, we had very few international human rights organizations. One of the first was Amnesty International, whose original purpose was to protect victims of torture, people facing the death sentence, and people who were imprisoned because of their ideas or beliefs. Now we have a very large range of international civil society organizations covering not only civil and political rights, but environmental rights, indigenous rights, economic rights, women's rights, gay and lesbian rights. We also have, since 1990, a transition to democracy in many countries. And there are correlations between democracy, human rights, and economic development. So democracy is, in my view, a necessary, although not a sufficient condition for human rights. As we have more democracies, so human rights generally, although not always, improve. So that's a little introduction with me tripping over the titles of some laws here because Dr. Thakur is making me nervous. But I'll turn it over to him now.
Thanks, Rhoda. Very helpfully, I left my speech notes behind in my office, which is fine, doesn't matter. He's got so much to say, he wants me to use 15 minutes for his thing. Rhoda is the professional expert, that's her area of specialty. As you can see, she's deeply knowledgeable about the general and the details of this whole subject. I dabbled on it, in it as a hobby. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You look around the world today, you read any day's newspapers, we have violations of human rights in many countries, in many parts of the world. That, if you like, represents the two bookends. Does that mean that it's a complete sham? I'd like to do three things. One, talk about the value and the enduring relevance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Two, look at some of the setbacks and curtailments and regress on that front in the name of the war on terror. And three, end up with an acknowledgement of the importance of individual action in fighting this good fight. The 20th century, one of its greatest achievements, I think, was the articulation, promotion, and advancement of the human rights norm. It is an embodiment of the universalization of the human conscience, an internationalization of the human conscience, articulated in the form of a universal human rights norm. The Genocide Convention was signed on 9th December, as Rhoda said. It didn't have even a single abstention. The Universal Declaration signed the next day. Some countries abstained. South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and I think the Soviet Union abstained. If you think of that, they abstained but they didn't oppose. The two together are a good illustration of the fact that already by the mid-century, they had been elevated to the status where countries and people who opposed it still found it impossible to oppose it publicly. The shaming factor was already there. And there are many issues where countries feel that they cannot but support whether they believe in it or not. And that's not a small element. I'll come back to that. The Universal Declaration historically is on par with some of the other great declarations, like the French Revolution or the American Declaration of Independence. But unlike them, this is for the first time an international affirmation of values and principles that we all say we hold dear. And we say it because we dare not disagree with it, as I said, whether we believe it or not. A human right, by definition, is a right that we have as a human being. It arises from the very fact of us being human beings. It doesn't arise from rank or office or gender or nationality or religion. Therefore, by definition, it has to be universal. If it belongs to us as human beings, it has to be universal, if it is a human right. But the interpretation and application are subject to local contexts, local sensibilities. Think, for example, of murder. Every society has a moral prohibition against murder. But the boundaries of what constitutes murder vary across different societies at any given time, and even within one society at different periods in time. Things like capital punishment, killing as a soldier on the orders of your government someone who's a complete stranger to you, abortion, euthanasia. Do these constitute murder? Even societies that prohibit murder have different answers to that, and people within societies have different answers to that. And that's where the sensitivity has to come in. Because these are moral issues, we have a tendency, because we take a moral position, to dub opponents or those who don't subscribe to that as immoral. We need to be aware of that. It is not necessarily the case. Different people can approach it from different perspectives and have equally and have legitimate claims to that. As Rhoda said, the Universal Declaration is supplemented by the two covenants in 1966. Between them, they recognize human beings as equal moral beings. It embodies the intuition that we are all rights-bearing equals. It embodies the moral intuition that we have the capacity to feel the pain of others if they are abused, if their basic rights are violated. And it is an acknowledgement of a juridical duty those of us living in zones of safety have towards others who live in zones of danger. In the nature of things, human right tends to be a claim on governments. But at the same time, people's rights are most seriously degraded and unenforced in conditions of absolute anarchy. So governments are necessary for a whole range of reasons to provide the legislative, judicial, other enforcement machinery that gives meaning to rights. And yet they are the ones who can most substantially, systematically, and for the longest period violate rights of their citizens as well. That duality is reflected in the entire international machinery for the monitoring and enforcement of human rights. That machinery grew not the least out of some of the requirements of, for example, the covenants, which have reporting requirements. If states, by signing on, are required to report to the United Nations, they then have to set up machinery within their countries to collect data on laws, on enforcement, submit this to the United Nations, which then has to have the capability to store these, collate them, and to judge conduct against them. At the same time, the United Nations is an intergovernmental forum. Governments have a common vested interest in reducing surveillance of their activities. They are not very keen to enforce some of these. But once they have signed on, we have multiple and repeated instances of people pulling out these signatures and saying to their own government, but you signed on to this international treaty. You have an international obligation to enforce these. We will hold you to that obligation. Those governments that can be shamed are shamed. They don't like that. They want to avoid that possibility at all. The Declaration and the human rights norm have also served as organizing principles for the activists, the advocates, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, what have you. And their starting point is these internationally articulated and internationally acknowledged standards and benchmarks. So the United Nations system as an intergovernmental forum is the only one to which governments can sign on to accept these standards, but the monitoring and the shaming is done typically much more effectively by the non-governmental organizations and civil society, and they work in partnership with that. Enforcement part is very weak for reasons that I've mentioned. But don't just blame, if you like, developing countries or retrograde countries now. At the time of the declaration, the British, for example, said it wouldn't apply to their colonies. The Truman administration assured Southern Democrats whose votes were needed for ratification that it wouldn't lead to things like votes for the blacks. So there were these exceptions put in. But for the bulk of the period, for several decades, the United States in particular and the West in general were the chief champions. And what happens with 9/11 and the War on Terror is they move to being among the principal, at least the United States, among the principal delinquents. With Guantanamo, with Abu Ghraib, with rendition, with torture. I mean, I would not have believed if you told me before that in my lifetime I would see Americans officially and seriously defending, let alone practicing torture. I thought we had left that behind. Torture appears on the prohibition shortlist of any person or analyst or government before this event. It's in everyone's shortlist of things to be prohibited. But they are not the only one. Many other governments have done that as well. They have changed laws, or within existing laws, they have simply changed administrative practices. But I don't want to single out the United States. I would not have believed possible what I saw on TV in this country, that a completely innocent visitor landing at one of our major international airports is for practical purposes murdered by the RCMP, and they get away with it. You see the outrage on the streets of Greece at one 15-year-old boy being killed. Where is the sustained outrage in this country at something for which we have collective responsibility because it is our agents acting in their official capacity who did it? And there are many other governments as well, which indicates that that sense of moral outrage does have to be maintained. We need to hold our own government's feet to the fire, as well as argue about it with other groups. And the final point I wanted to make in that, and that goes back to the individual thing. You think of some iconic cases, the Genocide Convention. We owe it to the efforts of one man, Raphael Lemkin, a Jew from Poland who suffered, had members of his family killed, and devoted his life to this legal protection. And on the day that the convention was signed in the General Assembly, on 9 December, he was discovered in one of the corridors of the assembly halls weeping. And he said, this is an epitaph to his mother, and I think her sister also, who were murdered by the Nazis. International humanitarian law. The ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Henri Dunant, witnessed the sufferings of soldiers in battle and said, we need to enact zones of safety for those who are out of commission, cannot fight. They need protection as well. And that whole development of international humanitarian law comes from that one person. Amnesty International, Peter Benenson. And the very sharp and poignant thing about prisoners of conscience, those who are imprisoned due to their political beliefs, and highlighting that and the techniques he evolved. These are powerful movements, powerful legacies of individuals who reacted with a sense of moral outrage, but converted that outrage into enduring institutional prohibitions and practices. Think how much worse off we would be today if that simply shrugged and said, we don't care, or we care, but we can't do anything. And that is why it is important for all of us as individuals to care about every other human being in every other part of the world. At the end of the day, if someone anywhere in the world is tortured or killed or otherwise abused with respect to his or her human rights, yes, I too, sitting comfortably in my offices in Waterloo, am morally diminished. Thank you very much.
It's very interesting. I'm going to change the direction of the discussion a little bit tonight. First of all, I had better mark down what time I started. I prefer to brandish my BlackBerry to do that. And I'm going to talk about human rights in Canadian foreign policy, and I'm going to make just 2 points. And the first one is that as we properly engage in self-reflection here tonight and more generally as we commemorate the issuance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and as we inevitably in that process reflect also on our own shortcomings, which are significant, we should also take care not to belittle or underestimate the progress that we've made as a society. And to substantiate that point, I'm going to talk about how others see us, drawing on my experience at the UN and elsewhere. And second, I'm going to offer some observations on contemporary Canadian foreign policy and human rights, and I'm going to offer some advice also so that we can maintain our reputation going forward. It was a Canadian, Professor John Humphreys, who had taught at McGill, who set up the first division for human rights at the United Nations and who ran that division for 20 years. And in the early part of his tenure at the United Nations, it was he who drafted, in large part, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and who guided it through the General Assembly to its adoption in 1948. And his accomplishments remain the standard by which the contributions of other Canadians to international affairs are measured. In my judgment, it's not just an accident of history that the Declaration was drafted by a Canadian. Tolerance, respect for others, and appreciation of diversity are all values that go deep into the roots of Canada. They're part of our DNA, a DNA that's traceable back to the 16th century and the reception of the Europeans by our Aboriginal peoples, and back to the 18th century when the English and French found themselves having to develop a modus vivendi in the New World. Our New World is not so new anymore, and developing a way of living together remains a work in progress, as we saw with some of the decidedly unparliamentary language we witnessed in Ottawa in the past 10 days or so, and also some of the intolerant commentary that was evident in the hearings of the Bouchard-Taylor Commission in Quebec earlier this year. But while it's important not to romanticize our history, which has often been painful, especially to Aboriginal Canadians, but also to newcomers, as the many apologies that our leaders issue attests, it is important, and while it's important to be honest and clear-headed about our contemporary behavior, as Ramesh is suggesting, which is short of the mark internationally and self-destructive sometimes at home, it's also important to recognize that we have made progress. During a long public service career, half of it spent abroad, and over the subsequent years working with foreigners, I come to understand that most of the rest of the world respects Canadians for the society we have created. Over the years, we have transformed ourselves into a compassionate, bilingual, multicultural society, perhaps the most diverse on earth, in which none is a majority, and where minorities can and do prosper. Take, for example, the city of Toronto. According to the most recent census, 52% of the population over age 15 was born in another country. That makes Toronto probably the most diverse city on the planet. The world knows we value diversity and that we integrate foreigners into our national life, not perfectly, but as well as, or better than, practically everybody else. We are seen abroad as a country that tries and mostly succeeds to respect human rights and to protect minorities, and that we're a country worthy of emulation, albeit one that should do better by its Aboriginal population, and that is not a trivial reservation by the rest of the world, for reasons that are evident, or should be evident, to all of us. So while self-satisfaction and complacency would be fatal to the Canadian enterprise, it remains nonetheless true that we are recognized abroad as a country which delivers a very high quality standard of living and a very important quality of life. We are known as a culture that generates remarkable excellence in literature, the arts, and science, and for education that propels its students into top levels of accomplishment, with Laurier leading the way in some fields. Our economy ranks about 10th in the world. We are a major trading country. Our resource base is vast. We have some of the very best business people in the world, some of them right here in Waterloo. We believe our banking system is sound and hope. Our modest population is larger than that of over 150 countries, and even our much maligned defense spending, our defense capability, is actually 12th in the world when measured in terms of military spending. So for all of these reasons, I found myself invariably getting a willing, respectful hearing whenever I spoke at the United Nations, but it was especially because of our reputation as a bilingual, multicultural, law-abiding, compassionate, and welcoming society. When I spoke in the UN Security Council in defense of the International Criminal Court from the Bush administration's attacks on it, or on protecting civilians in armed conflict, or on protecting women's rights in Afghanistan, or on stopping the blood diamond trade in Africa, or on avoiding what was evidently going to be a catastrophic war in Iraq, my words carried weight because I was the representative of Canada at the United Nations. Over many generations, but especially since 1948, we have acquired a reputation as a principled, constructive, effective contributor, especially to the development of human rights and humanitarian law. To see ourselves as others see us, according to Robert Burns, and paraphrasing him, would save us from many a blunder and foolish notion. So how do others see us? Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said that Canada is an exemplary member of our organization. Afghanistan President Hamid Karzai has called Canada a great nation that is a model to the rest of us for all that is good. Former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair said what binds us, that is Canada and the UK, together is a common belief in the values of democracy, the benefits of the rule of law, and the ultimate need to protect human rights. And Bill Clinton stated that we, Canada and the United States, share core values, including an ardent belief in democracy. I've chosen these citations, obviously, not because they would contradict the point I was making, but because they would reinforce it. But I want to assure you that they are, in my experience, representative of the view of Canada abroad. Professor Humphreys laid the foundation for this reputation, and many others helped to build it. Prime Minister Pearson changed Canadian immigration policy and made it colorblind. His foreign minister, Paul Martin Sr., was instrumental in allowing the decolonized world, all of the countries of Africa, to join the United Nations. Prime Minister Diefenbaker took a strong and principled stand against apartheid in South Africa, that South Africa expelled from the Commonwealth. In Prime Minister Trudeau's time, Canada led the work on Basket 3 of the Helsinki Final Act, which was the part on human rights. And that act was progressively to loosen communism's grip on the countries of Eastern Europe, to which Ramesh alluded a little bit earlier. Under Mr. Trudeau, we also criticized human rights abuses in Central America. Even in Mr. Clark's short-lived government, Vietnamese boat people were brought to better lives in Canada. The Mulroney Progressive Conservative government in its 1984 Foreign Policy Review entitled Prosperity and Security or competitiveness in security. I should remember that because I wrote it, actually. Acknowledged the significance of human rights to Canada's standing in the world. Mr. Mulroney led the successful fight to impose and maintain sanctions on the apartheid regime in South Africa over powerful British, Margaret Thatcher, and American, Ronald Reagan opposition, for which he was personally thanked by President Nelson Mandela. Mr. Mulroney also co-chaired the UN Summit on Children's Rights, which brought about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which now enjoys near universal adherence. The Chrétien government's 1995 Foreign Policy Review made democracy and human rights promotion a prominent objective, and it also implemented a human security agenda, which included leadership in the creation of the International Criminal Court and the Sierra Leone Hybrid Court, the initiation of the Ottawa Land and signature of the Ottawa Landmines Treaty, the initiation and intensification of the UN's efforts to protect civilians in armed conflict, endorsement of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, ratification of both optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, including on child soldiers, leadership on women's rights, especially the Beijing Conference, the imposition of effective sanctions on UNITA regarding blood diamonds, the establishment of International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, and so on. Interestingly, the new U.S. government appears to be about to implement a foreign policy that has much to do with Canada's human security agenda. According to the New York Times just last week, President Obama signals his intention to create a greatly expanded corps of diplomats and aid workers to engage in preventing conflicts and rebuilding failed states. And that sounds a lot like the human security agenda that, ironically, Ottawa has just expunged from its own vocabulary, and just as the term is gaining currency around the world. The Martin government, in its short term in office, made, in its international policy statement, stressed human rights, and it was also very instrumental in the adoption at the UN of the responsibility to protect. One person who should get mentioned for her extraordinary service, there are too many, there are countless, uncounted Canadians who've contributed to this reputation, is Louise Arbour, both as the prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals on Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, for which she literally got no thanks from her own government, the only one at the Human Rights Council that day not to commend her service when she resigned. In the 1980s, U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz coined the term light switch diplomacy, by which he meant the proclivity of governments to change their policy positions every time somebody new came to office. He didn't regard that as a compliment, that was an error. And light switch diplomacy has also a strong appeal in Canada. IR theory notwithstanding, governments do change their positions every time a new prime minister is elected, every time a new prime minister takes office, even when there's a change between ministers in the same government. And they often manifest a not invented here syndrome for whatever it was that their predecessors, even in their own parties, were pursuing. Nowhere has this impulse been stronger than on human rights. And added to this tendency in recent years has been a partisan political quotient that has produced diaspora-sensitive politics that are an admixture of high principle and political mercantilism. Further, Ottawa's overall engagement on human rights has been geared down, partly because of the distractions of minority government and elections, which is entirely understandable, and the press of bad economic news, which is also understandable, but partly also because of a discernible disinclination, which is less understandable. All of this has produced a number of policy changes that are impacting on our international reputation. For example, at the UN, the Martin government began to change positions taken by a succession of Canadian governments on the annual series of votes on the Middle East, even when the facts on the ground had not changed. thus effectively abandoning the fair-minded and principled posture adopted by previous liberal and conservative governments going back years. On coming to office, the Harper government realigned Canadian votes on the Middle East still closer to the USA and others. In the Israeli-Lebanon war, Prime Minister Harper described the massive Israeli response as measured, a judgment that was explicitly not shared by either Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or the UN Secretary General or most other Western governments. More recently, Canada has been alone among Western countries in accepting the kangaroo court process in Guantanamo, leaving a Canadian child soldier, Omar Khadr, to face a process that even the U.S. Supreme Court has criticized and that President-elect Obama has said he would end. Further, in 2007, for the first time, Canada did not co-sponsor the annual death penalty resolution at the UN General Assembly, although it ultimately voted for it. Meanwhile, the government pulled back abruptly on Canadian support for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of which Canada had been a leader. And to the disappointment of Africans, the government has decided quite some time ago that it would not participate in the preparations for the Durban Review Conference on Human Rights. And they did it apparently out of concern that the outcome would be too critical of Israel, and that is a concern that is amply justified. I was the head of the delegation at Durban 1, and I was appalled by the experience, although I would say that most of the completely unacceptable behavior was outside the halls, carried on by civil society. I've always been slightly suspicious of that word, although there was plenty of criticism inside the hall as well. At Durban, I made perhaps the strongest statement that any Canadian official has ever made at an international conference against singling out Israel. But I think nevertheless that pulling out ahead of time is probably a mistake in both substance and tactical terms. On substance, there's plenty of more on the human rights agenda than the Middle East, and our absence from the preparations risks sending the wrong message that we don't care about that. And in technical terms, I think we should have told the organizers that we would attend, but that our continued participation would be conditional on the conference not singling Israel out. And then we should have negotiated for a better outcome. If we didn't get it, we could leave at that point, making as much noise as we wanted to make. Within the Foreign Affairs Department and elsewhere in Ottawa, human rights advocacy capacity has eroded, especially as regards women's rights. All of this is not to say, however, and I want to emphasize that the record is unremittingly disappointing. It's not. In Geneva, Canadian officials have carried on with the Canadian human rights agenda, notably in the work done to develop the processes of the new Human Rights Council, relatively new, including the new Universal Periodic Review Mechanism. In New York, Canada has persevered in running the Iran resolution, which is an annual resolution condemning Iranian human rights, and that has been done successfully, so far at least. And in Afghanistan, in the most unpropitious of circumstances, progress has been made on human rights, including access to education and health care, and belatedly on the transfer of detainees. I'd like to conclude with some policy advice. All change in policy is not wrong. It doesn't follow that when one government follows another, it has to just simply pick up where the other one left off, or there probably would be no reason to have changed them in the first place. But change that does not take account of the principles and values that underlie the existing policies risks being arbitrary. In recent years, it is difficult to avoid the judgment that there has been an arbitrary and ideological character to some of our policy changes, and a certain retreat from leadership as well. And together, these tendencies are affecting Canada's reputation. In his 2005 report to the UN entitled Enlarger Freedom, then Secretary General Annan urged membership to make human rights the third pillar of the UN. He made the observation that there can be no security without development, no development without security, and no security or development without human rights protection. These insights have not yet been assimilated in most capitals, and that includes Ottawa. And in my view, it would be wise for the Canadian government both to avoid the practice of light switch diplomacy to the extent possible, and to make respect for human rights the full-fledged third pillar of Canadian foreign policy. President-elect Barack Obama has characterized foreign policy as 10% agenda and 90% circumstance. In the dizzying torrents of international events, coherence is difficult to maintain. But respect for the rule of law, especially international human rights treaties and humanitarian law, together with due regard for the principles that underlie previous government positions, would bring beneficial coherence to Canadian policy and would permit us to maintain Canada's reputation as an effective promoter of human rights abroad. Thank you.
Thanks to all our speakers. They've graciously agreed to take questions. We have 2 microphones, and if you would like to pose a question, we'd ask you to step to a microphone, please. While we're waiting for people to make their way to the microphones, we'll give you an opportunity to respond to each other if you so choose.
I do actually have something to say with regard to John Humphrey, with whom I had the pleasure once of staying for 4 days. I was very impressed by Humphrey and thought indeed that his writing of economic rights into the first draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reflected Canadian policy and perhaps the Canadian ethos at the time. But his biographer at McGill tells me that both the government and the Canadian business community were quite annoyed at him for writing those economic, social and cultural rights into the first draft of the covenant. So here we have an example actually of the power of one. Once again, a Canadian who on his own initiative did something that his own government wasn't at least too happy about.
Thanks, Dr. Hassman. At mic 1, we have a question.
Hi, this is for Dr. Heinbecker. Do you think that Michael Ignatieff will be any better than what we have now in terms of human rights?
Who's that directed to?
You directed that to me. Yes and no. I think I would actually rather you had directed that question to Ramesh Thakur, but there's a reason in addition to political cowardice. Dr. Thakur was a commissioner, along with Michael Ignatieff, on the Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, which brought us the norm, I hope it is a norm, of the responsibility to protect. And it was evident in that process that Michael Ignatieff has a long history in human rights. He was the head of the Carr Center on Human Rights at Harvard. And I think he will come to office, the least that could be said is that he will come to office with a much better understanding of international affairs generally and of the place of human rights in international affairs than probably any Canadian Prime Minister, if he becomes Prime Minister, than any Canadian Prime Minister or leader ever. I think would be a fair comment, going all the way back to Pearson and beyond.
What about his remarks about torture, though?
I guess what I'd have to say to that is there are a number of things in which I would disagree with what he said. That would be one. I disagreed with him on 2 other things that were not trivial. One was his opposition to the Iraq War in 1990, and the other was his support for the U.S. administration's decision on the Iraq War in 2003, which he has subsequently, as has many others, decided that indicated that were he to make the decision over again, it would be different.
Would anybody else like to comment on our possible future Prime Minister?
I think he has good intentions, and he certainly is a very learned man with regard to human rights. But he's an inexperienced politician, so perhaps it's not just foreign policy that's 90% circumstance. It's perhaps any policy, so we don't know how he's going to react to that.
I think it's a cautionary warning against the dangers of rushing to use military force because you have such a fervent belief in the superior moral position of your human rights approach. It's an issue that divided the humanitarian community, and we had the rise of the so-called humanitarian warriors who I think tended to forget just how brutal war can be and how easily it can take you down the road of very nasty unintended consequences. It is a last resort thing. I think Michael, when he started supporting in his writings in favor of the Iraq War in 2003, in a sense went back from some important principles and conditions we had in our report. I hope he's a chastened man. We hope he has learned. If he can bring his fervor and morality along with his deep knowledge of world affairs and combine that with fresh wisdom from the point of view of a politician, it will be a happy ending. Otherwise, we might have some rough times.
Thank you. Mike 2.
Thanks. I have a question for Dr. Hassman. Dr. Thakur is on a topic that Ambassador Heinbecker alluded to, and that's the where we go now from in terms of the Obama administration. Should we lower our expectations of the Obama administration as we have a financial crisis going on? So some people are saying that he's going to focus on that and leave the foreign policy to his newly appointed Secretary of State, Clinton. Or and so, yes, if I can hear your views, especially Dr. Thakur, as you've been the most vocal in criticizing the current Bush administration. So how are these states going to behave in relation to other countries, and whether they're going, or whether this Obama administration is going to continue to respect human rights as other previous administrations, other than, I guess, the current administration, the Bush administration, has in international relations?
Thanks. Well, first thing to, I think, say is that we really don't have much basis for guessing what he will do once he is in power. I mean, the fact is his legislative and executive records to date are very thin, so we really don't know. From his statements, we hope he will do the right things. I don't think anything he's done by way of appointments to his cabinet show conclusively that on the real issues that are going to matter, he's going back on his convictions. But on this set of issues, I think there will be some early tests, which I think are clear tests, and there will be very little room for compromise on them. One, I would like to see, if I had my way, I would like to see Guantanamo closed on day one. I see no reason why people cannot be tried in existing established institutions. He has the cover to do that now with the Supreme Court decisions that Ambassador Heinbecker was referring to. I would like to see very clear statements from the President the day he assumes office that torture is against US values, will never be a part of US policy, and will not form part of the practice of any American agencies. I would like to see him sign on to the International Criminal Court. I'd like to see him sign on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I would like to see him abandon the hostility with which the Bush administration has approached any national agency or international organization that promotes family planning. These are issues on which he can take stands and convert those stands into policy relatively pain-free and very early. If there is delays on them, if there is fudging on those, then I think we will have cause for disappointment. So we have to wait and see.
I don't actually take a backseat to even Ramesh in criticizing the Bush administration.
He gets very offended if anyone says he's second to someone else.
On that score. The Bush administration had brought, the policies of the Bush administration have been catastrophic for the United States and for the rest of us as well in a lot of ways. A lot of things in which Canadians believe very deeply, starting with the rule of law, the protection of the rights of minorities, have been offended by the Bush administration. I'd like to just make a point, whether, you know, the question of whether Obama will be able to do the kind of things and whether he would do the kind of things, whether he's the right sort of person for the times. I think it's very important to bear in mind that this is a man who was born of an African father, whose mother traveled the world and worked abroad. He was raised part of his life in Indonesia. The rest of his early life was spent in Hawaii, which is not part of mainstream United States, mainland, and certainly not mainland and not mainstream either. He comes with a cosmopolitan view of the world inherently and inevitably that most of the other people one can think of in the Bush administration, certainly, and even with Senator McCain, really didn't have. Senator McCain was the grandson of a naval admiral, the son of a naval admiral, a graduate of the Naval Academy, a man who, when he went into politics, became a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. His was an entirely national security-based approach to the world. And if you look at the way the world is now, when you see the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil, the return of Russia, the power of Europe, this is a world that's not going to be dominated by anybody. This is a world for diplomacy, and this is a world for a sophisticated understanding of how the international system works. So in that respect, I'm very encouraged and very hopeful. I think it is the case that he's going to have to, job one is going to be the international financial crisis, and specifically its impact in the United States. But you know, the U.S. administration is a big administration. There are a lot of people, there will be a lot of appointments, thousands of appointments will be made. And the first signs are that he is appointing very high-quality people, and I think, that's something that both, given his own vision, which he's articulated, and by the way, you can look it up on YouTube if you want to. He's on record, personally, setting out some aspects of his foreign policy on YouTube, which are really quite significant. His policies on missile defense, his policies on weaponization of space, on the test ban treaty, on other aspects of the international nuclear disarmament regime, arms control and disarmament regime, are very, very close to the policies that Canada has espoused for a number of years. So in principle, I guess I should conclude with this, in principle, there is quite a convergence between what I would call traditional Canadian foreign policy and the directions that Mr. Obama says he wants to go.
But just before we demonize, sorry, Rhoda, just before we demonize the Bush administration too much, just recall the number of governments. He thinks it can't be possible to demonize them too much. Okay. Let's think of the number of governments that were complicit in the rendition policy, including our one.
I want to add to this. I agree with everything Paul and Ramesh have said. I don't know where my demonization rating is. Tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans suffer massive violations of their human rights. Something like 46 or 47 million Americans last time I checked were without any kind of health insurance. The level of inequality between rich and poor is much higher in the United States than in Canada, which doesn't do very well either. Obama couldn't even mention the word poor, as far as I could tell, during his campaign, because poor is code for black, and he had to distance himself from the public, or some public's image of inner city blacks. So I hope he is able to continue with his policy that he has said he wants to do of having universal health care. I hope once he becomes president, he will directly address the poor. And I hope, although I think it's unlikely, that he will address the fact that gays and lesbians suffer violations of their rights and are unprotected in a large number of American states.
I can just make a closing comment.
If I could make one more comment on something that Ramesh has said, actually two things. My reading of the Arar Commission report does not suggest Canadian government complicity in rendition. In fact, I think the report says that the Canadian government didn't know that Maher Arar was going to be sent to New York or to Syria, and indeed that's partly what the argument his lawyers have been making today in New York. Certainly there were Canadians who behaved in ways which brought about that outcome, but I don't think it's fair to say the government was complicit in it, at least not the government as I think of the government. And the same thing, the same comment I think I would make in British Columbia. There's describing what the RCMP did to the Polish visitor as murder, I think is a statement I can't subscribe to. I think he was treated in ways that were way beyond what's acceptable. But it's clear that there's no intent just to murder him. If that had been the case, they went about it in the most indirect way by using tasers and not the other weapons which they had available with them. So I think I would take the view that while there was, I'm not condoning in any sense what was done. In fact, I criticize it vehemently. And I agree with Ramesh that the outcry has not been strong enough, although there has been an outcry. Nevertheless, to portray it as murder, I think, is strong.
Mike 1? Go ahead.
Changing gears a moment, I'd like to address this question to Dr. Heinbecker. When you were talking about light switch politics, you talked about the erosion over the last couple of years of women's rights in Canada. Would you be able to sort of elaborate on that? I mean, I really haven't been paying attention to it, and I'm not actually quite sure what you're referring to.
I didn't hear your sort of secondary comment. Can you repeat it?
Speak closer to the mic.
Okay. You mentioned the erosion of women's rights in Canada over the past couple of years, and I just wasn't quite sure what you were referring to.
But I didn't say the erosion of women's rights in Canada over the past couple of years. I said an erosion of the foreign affairs departments and some of the other departments in Ottawa's capability to promote women's rights abroad.
Okay.
To be specific, that has to do with the Heritage Department and the capacity there, and it also has to do with the budgetary circumstances in the Foreign Affairs Department and the decisions which have been made as a consequence of that. So I think it's fair to say that we are not putting the priority on the protection of women's rights that we used to. One can interpret that as a consequence of fiscal policy choices of the current government, or you could see it in more ideological terms. I tend to think of it as the former with perhaps a little bit of the latter.
Ardith, you've been waiting. Go ahead, Mike 1. Ardith. You've been waiting for what? Go ahead.
Good evening. I'm Ardith Toogood. I'm from the Canadian Federation of University Women. And my question has to do with the voice of civil society here in Canada. You talked about individuals and the responsibility regarding human rights. And I wondered if you could comment on non-governmental organizations and when we feel that our voices are being silenced or at least not heard, are there other methods that NGOs could use to address human rights issues in this country? It's been difficult over the last almost 3 years now to be heard?
I don't know who's that directed to?
Anyone who cares to answer.
You're talking about Canada, go on.
Well, I will answer that. One method that people use when they're not heard is to go out on the streets and demonstrate and commit civil disobedience. I'm serious here. Especially democratic governments will sometimes negotiate with more moderate people when more radical people are taking action which stretches the boundaries of what is considered to be civil. Now, civil disobedience, in my mind, is civil. It is an action that groups take when they want policies to be changed. One of the reasons that the feminist movement got the attention of the Canadian government back in the late 60s and 70s was precisely because women and some of their male allies were taking those kinds of actions, along with more organized, policy-oriented, non-governmental organizations. The other way, of course, is to vote. I can't speak to the particulars of the Harper government, but if you combine those three things together, as you probably know better than I do, you have more of a chance of getting changes. But that's because I'm originally a political sociologist, so, as well as somebody who was out on the streets in 1970.
I'm always tempted to think that there's an answer somewhere on the internet.
Use the internet.
Or in the internet.
Use the internet.
Using the internet. I just have, I say this not quite facetiously, that is, be careful what you wish for when you talk about civil society because and NGOs and how to strengthen them. Because when I was at the UN, the National Rifle Association was quite effective in watering down a small arms treaty. And Big Pharma was quite good at blocking the sale of generic HIV/AIDS drugs to Africa. And Big Tobacco is pretty strong in defending its interests in the third world, and those are all, sort of literally by definition, non-governmental organizations. So I'm always, as a former government official, I'm always a little bit suspicious when I hear the term NGOs used as though it was always going to be in the interest of some kind of progressive outcome, because I don't think that that's necessarily the case. That said, obviously the kind of organization you represent, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, CARE, there's a huge list of indispensable international organizations that are having a very significant and beneficial impact. But I'm just, as a former official, I want to look a little bit at the fine print before I agree to support whatever it is an NGO might want to do.
But that also contains the key to the answer as well. Learn from those techniques, repeat them, and do them better and more effectively. They have the money, you have the votes. As Rhoda said, use the power of the vote, stay engaged, lobby, advocate, publicize, organize, question the parliamentarians, question officials. There's a whole range of techniques and instruments available. And that's how progress has been achieved throughout history.
Thank you. Ricardo, be the last question.
My name is Ricardo Tranjan. I'm a PhD student at Bowsley School. And in thinking of the way ahead, the next 60 years, if you will, of human rights, I was wondering if the panel could comment on the relationship between human rights and human security. Some will argue that human security is a pragmatic language that we allow for implementation, enforcement of human rights, which has been the kind of short end of the last 60 years. And on the other hand, some skepticals will say, well, by using this more realistic language of human rights, using the language of security, we are going away from the moral underpinning that allow us to come to the declaration. We're succumbing to the old ways of doing politics. As a skeptical student, I haven't arrived at any conclusion, and I would love to hear what you have to say about it. Any of the panelists would like to address the question.
Thanks.
Well, there's some overlap, but also distinctions. The terms are not synonymous, they're not interchangeable. Human security has two distinct intellectual and political traditions. One from the human rights discourse, the other from the development and welfare discourse. Politically, you see them represented, for example, in Canada's foreign policy under Lord Axworthy, and in Japan's foreign policy, which also talks of human security, but much more clearly the development side of it. But there are overlaps as well. It's inconceivable that you can achieve human security in conditions where human rights are being violated. And let's not forget the opening words of the Universal, actually most people do forget, the opening words of the Universal Declaration are, we are all equal in dignity and in rights. Dignity speaks much more closely to human security as well. And I think we should remember that.
I can tell an anecdote. I was there at the creation, so to speak, of the Canadian Human Rights, or Canadian Human Security Agenda. We tried to define that agenda as narrowly as possible. We wanted, if people weren't bleeding, it wasn't human security in our judgment. That sounds rather extreme, but we took the view, and I think we were justified in taking the view that an expansive definition of human security, in which it talked about job security and economic development and social development and all of the other developments, would basically be about everything, and therefore would be about nothing. That we really wanted very much to focus on what to do when people were being abused by their own governments, when they were being abused and they were being killed and murdered and raped and mutilated, driven out in ethnic cleansing, and otherwise persecuted. We wanted that was what we wanted to focus on. We knew that economic development was important. We knew that dignity, because this is part of the area where we disagreed with the Japanese, was important. But if you look at the outcome, I think, if you look at what's happened subsequently, and this is a controversial statement, I think the fact is that we were more successful than the Japanese were. The Japanese had a much more expansive definition, partly because of their own constitution. They didn't want to include anything about the military and military intervention in their interpretations of human security. And I think that the record will show that we've had a bigger impact than the Japanese did, and that the narrower definition was the right way to go. But that's an anecdote that doesn't really answer your question.
Well, my answer is that you've asked me this question 6 months too soon. I am somewhat concerned that human security, depending on in whose interpretation it is and in whose hands, could undermine human rights. I could envisage a world fascism, for example, in which the vast majority of people lived in security, had their right to peace protected, but minorities or protesters were not secure. As a foreign policy initiative, I think it's a very good idea. On the other hand, the breadth of human rights, even though it cannot be immediately implemented, does provide a very wide normative basis of how people ought to be treated and what it means to respect their dignity. To be completely facetious, you can starve without bleeding. And that's one of the problems if you narrow the focus too much. So on the one hand, as somebody who's actually a fairly political realist type, I think it's a good idea to have a definition that focuses on some core human rights violations and says these ones must stop. But I'm still a little worried, but it's too soon to answer your question.
Well, just to give you an example of the difficulty conceptually and politically and operationally. You may have seen these statistics that came out that under President Thabo Mbeki's reign in South Africa, his denial of the reality of HIV/AIDS led to the excess death or unnecessary or avoidable death of something like 300,000, I think the figure was. Now, is that a violation of human rights? Is that a violation of human security? Is it irrelevant to human security? Under the strict definition of if it's not bleeding, it's not human security. Presumably,
we would include dying as
bleeding. Okay, right, okay.
Because then you get down the all sorts of interesting arguments there as well. So they're difficult issues, they're contested issues, but that's true of virtually every important concept in social sciences.
But what Mbeki did is a violation of human rights. Human rights says every individual is entitled to the highest attainable standard of health. That's not possible in the real world, but we're talking about a much lower standard of health, and Mbeki denied that to his people for some years. So it is definitely a violation of human rights.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening on this very wintry night. Literally around the world today, communities are marking the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration. So I'm thrilled that we can add Wilfrid Laurier University to the list of communities that mark this anniversary, and in such a thought-provoking and insightful way. So please join me in thanking Ambassador Heinbecker, Dr. Thakur, and Dr. Howard Hassman. Thank you.